This is one of the most critical parts of how the brake works at this point. Between those two bearings needs to be a crush tube. This crush tube that we're using is chrome moly tubing that has a 3/4 inch ID and a 1.25 inch OD. By choosing this, we know that the crush tube, when properly cut on a lathe, sits flat against the inside race of that bearing. Likewise, it sits flat against the inside bearing on the other side. This is critical for the proper performance of the brake. The crush tube, if it is too long, when bolted together, will not allow the center bearings to rotate because there will be too much pressure against the ball bearings. If it's too loose, it'll bounce between, allowing the no crush from the outside in through the brake, through the crush tube to the other side. This is a critical measurement that has to be done using a vernier caliper and is critical down to thousandths. Very, very important at this point that when you locate your final setup and you torque your hat down to the spacers, you then measure from the face of the inner race of the lower bearing to the face of the outer race on the upper bearing. The outer race. Once you've made that measurement, you then subtract the thickness of that bearing, which in this case is 0.825, and that gives you the exact length of the crush tube you need. The only acceptable method of cutting this crush tube is using a lathe and a smooth cut end. This is not okay to be done with a hacksaw or any type of cutoff saw, as it'll leave a rough surface and isn't suitable for exact measurement. Once cut, the crush tube gets inserted and it sits on the face of the bottom bearing. The top hat goes over the top, now sitting on the face of the top bearing, and we would insert our pills. For the essence of time, we're only going to use 2 pills on this installation. Each brake comes with 5, and there's 5 bolt holes. By turning the pills around from one side to the other, we'll change the exact center location for that hole. So it's important to note which way they're going. On our installation, the pills are going in with the small side to the inside. We recommend then that you use Loctite Red 271 or 272 for the final installation. We know that you have the crush tube the right size correctly because we went through the measurement a moment ago. When you install this, we want you to do cross torque to make sure that the hat sits flat, and we want you to use a Loctite product 271 or 272 or its equivalent. It's important to make sure that this does not have any vibration that allows these bolts to back out or these hubs to become loose. As well, you'll notice that the pill has a standard depth. It is imperative that the head of the bolt does not stick up any further than the top end of that pill. If so, this could contact the inner side of the pressure plate of the brake. We'll talk about that in a moment. So please make sure that the head does not protrude. If it does, it'll need to be machined off. Prior to tightening the bolts on what we call the rotor hat all the way down to the spacer and therefore through to the wheel, we'd like to insert your top hat bushing in the case of a 3/4 inch or something other than a 1 inch axle. Once you insert top hat bushings through the bearing or your 1 inch axle, it then allows us to go ahead and center that crush tube in the assembly all together. Once you have that assembled, go ahead and finish tightening the hex bolts holding the hat down, and then go through your torque sequence. Your final check for this will be to spin the wheel, and the wheel should spin freely on the bearings. Once that's spinning freely, you know that you have a good alignment and setup. The next check for the top hat, for the crush tube length, if the length is correct, you will be able to turn the inside race of the bearing, and likewise, simultaneously, it will be turning the other side. This lets us know that there's the proper pressure between the inside race of the bearing through the crush tube to the other bearing. This becomes important when we tighten the whole assembly down. In a normal setup, the axle will not turn. The only thing that will be turning is the outer race of the wheel. We don't want the inner race turning. We want it locked solid with the axle. In your installation, the caliper and brake assembly would then be applied into the top hat Pressure would be put on the outside of the caliper either using a top hat bushing, which has an 1/8 inch lip, which sets your gap between the caliper and your fork leg, or using, in the case of a 1-inch bearing where no top hat bushing is needed, what we call a wedding ring spacer. And it's going to be 1/4 of an inch, which would then set your gap. Again, we're looking for no less than 1/8 of an inch, and 1/4 inch being ideal on that side. On the opposite side, you're going to use an axle spacer to finish the distance to your other fork. And this is variable that can help to do your final settlement and adjustment, so that when you torque on one side of the fork, it puts pressure all the way through. So to recap, we have a billet wheel, we have an aluminum spacer that is needed, this is a hub spacer, and this is an axle spacer. These axle spacers are easier to fabricate, but we want to put as much into the hub as possible to keep this bearing and that bearing as far away as apart. In this particular case, the wheel's ready to go onto the motorcycle at this point.